archives. It's Comdt Victor Laing. He joined the Defence Forces in 1974 and was commissioned in 1976 when he was posted to College Barracks in Cork. He served in various appointments at home and abroad until he was posted to Army Headquarters as a staff officer in the military archives in 1986. And then he was appointed as officer in charge in 1998, a position he held until he retired from the Defence Forces in 2012. He's a graduate in history from NUI Galway and a postgraduate in archival studies from UCD. He has a particular interest in the years 1912 to 1923 in Irish history. He is a member of the Military History Society of Ireland and the Military Heritage of Ireland Trust. So can I introduce Comdt Victor Laing?
Thank you, Maeve. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming out on this fairly horrendous Friday evening. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no argument that the Rising was initiated by a very small splinter group who found themselves in an unusual position on the eve of Easter 1916. The Irish Volunteers had split from the main body in September 1914 due to the decision of Redmond to support the war effort. Once that decision had been made, the course was set. This splinter group felt that failure to take advantage of British involvement and deployment within the European theatre of war and elsewhere would be a wasted opportunity. The small group who formed the Military Council on the eve of the Rising in 1916 was an unusual and very diverse group of individuals. There were various strains of determination, if I may use that description, embodied within the group. Tom Clarke represented the Fenian tradition, strongly supported by Sean McDermott in an organising role. James Connolly, with the socialist ideology, was co-opted early in 1916, and therein lies a long story and still an interesting debate. He brought along with him a well-structured body of soldiers in the region of about 300 strong, who had been trained to support the workers in the event of any industrial unrest. The volunteer leadership badly needed this armed and uniformed force alongside their ranks. They had yet to achieve the same standards as the Irish Citizen Army in some areas. Pearse, MacDonagh and Plunkett brought more of an academic influence. They were the dreamers, the poets, the writers and teachers. They too carried a spirit, a flame, and with it the willingness to die for Ireland. Above all others, Pearse appears to be the most complex, interpreted in so many different ways. He had a lifelong interest in Robert Emmet, and he potentially saw himself as an extension of those who had previously given their lives in resistance to English authority. Kent, too, had a deep... I'm back onto Kent. As you can see, he's carrying the pipes there on your bottom left. Kent, too, had a deep commitment to the cause. You may have heard Professor Ruth Dudley-Edwards in recent times stating that she believes that Kent was militarily one of the more competent of the leaders. We can look at each leader and identify specific traits and qualities of note. Each of these leaders were resigned and arguably reconciled to their fate on the eve of the Rising. Some, such as Pearse, believed that this was the only way freedom could be gained, realising that it would take their death and recognise martyrdom to achieve the positive results required of any such interaction. Many were serious, but MacDonagh is always noted for his sense of humour and upbeat nature. Casement had set out his views on Ireland's road to complete independence in the Irish Review in 1912. This was a monthly literary review published by his friends Joseph Plunkett and Thomas MacDonagh. One can see the connections formed many years in advance of the Rising. Pearse in particular, but others within the leadership, had also come out and laid their plans long before the Rising in their writings. And some of these were played out on the Abbey stage. One of MacDonagh's plays, titled When the Dawn Has Come, was produced on the same stage, poignantly based upon the theme of a rebellion led by a council of 7. Plunkett and Connolly were also playwrights. The cultural revival provided not only the platform, but also the stage for this expression. An examination of the writings of so many will reveal how they were thinking. Was Pearse, MacDonagh, and others' dreams of a rebellion in Ireland an aspiration, a warning, or a statement of intent in theatre? Available for one and all to see as a dramatic expression, and with it a desire to restate a wish to self-govern by force of arms once again. In 1967, F.X. Martin, a notable historian, in an article titled 1916, Myth, Fact and Mystery, said about the rising that it was imaginatively planned with artistic vision, and the revolt was staged consciously as a drama by its principal actors. With all of its intelligence-gathering capability, the authorities dismissed these warning signs at their expense. Again, one might ask the question, what could they do? They were maintaining a high level of surveillance on all the key personalities. Did they become complacent? (1641, 1798, 1803, 1848 and 1867 had all maintained a tradition of physical force reaction, but more importantly, a continuity that the leaders and volunteers of 16 were anxious to maintain. The formation of the Gaelic League and the Literary Revival was a vital element in this continuity and provided a platform on which to move forward. Arguably, Parnell and the Irish Parliamentary Party had had their day and failed to realise the political success that they'd hoped for. Now the Home Rule crisis was to force the hand once again, and on the 25th of November 1913, the Irish Volunteers were formed in the Rotunda as a reaction to the formation of the Ulster Volunteers. The initial response to the formation of the Volunteers was a little slow on the uptake, but they were to reach a peak strength of some 185,000 by September 1914. The split after Wooden Bridge resulted in some 13,000 remaining under the Irish Volunteers at home, with the balance pledging their support towards the war effort under the National Volunteers. RIC, or Royal Irish Constabulary, estimates of 9,000 members may be more accurate, according to Dr. Dahi O'Caron. Within the newly formed Irish Volunteers, a further split was to result on the lead into Easter 16, with Bulmer Hobson, Owen McNeill, the O'Rahilly and JJ or Ginger O'Connell, believing that the time was not right for military action and favouring longer-term policy rather than a military strike. As this period from the 1890s into early 1912 progressed, many organisations, groups and societies were formed. Training in a scouting to military sense was provided by the Fianna, and this provided a much-valued recruiting ground for the volunteers. There were to be many visits abroad to raise awareness, to collect money and rally support. And naturally, a lot of this effort was focused on America, but Germany was also going to become a centre of attention closer to the Rising. Irish migration had resulted in quite strong blocks of first and second generation Irish, mainly on the east coast of the States. Prominent newspapers, along with sporting and cultural clubs and organisations, were to provide the means of communication, raising awareness, support, and ultimately assisting fundraising. Money was raised and arms were purchased. Large sums were collected by committees, and some substantial funding extended directly from a few wealthy supporters in the lead into these missions to land weapons in Howth and Wicklow. But regretfully, the loss of arms resulting from the inability of the odd to land meant that the Irish Volunteers were to be extremely short on modern and efficient weaponry on the ground when the time came. Training, parades and dress rehearsals all formed the backdrop to the eventual order to mobilise. An examination of the newspapers of the day details the level of activity. But what, however, is not highlighted is the planning by the Military Council. One such meeting is recounted by Anya Kant in a recording made to the Bureau of Military History late on in his lifetime. In it, she says, a meeting was held at her home in Dolphin's Barn towards the end of 1915, at which Tom Clark, Sean McDermott, Patrick Pearse and Joseph Plunkett were present, with her husband Eamon. She also recounts a further meeting in February 16, at which James Connolly was present along with the aforementioned. This was after he was co-opted to the council. Arguably, all these activities were indicators of the determination and intent that preparation for action was in position. While the decision was made to take to the field, so as to speak, there is no doubt that the leadership felt that their efforts were going to be short-lived, based on their limited manpower but also resources. Failure to land the arms from Germany and the attempt to disguise the forthcoming mobilisation from Owen McNeill proved critical. Even against the flow, in the knowledge that the authorities must be aware of the momentum gathering from such actions, the leadership backed their decision and mobilised on foot of the countermanding order. For on the morning in question, leaders and volunteers spoke of the limited success they could anticipate as they marched to take over the GPO. Some spoke in no uncertain terms that failure was imminent. Accounts contained within the witness statements of the Bureau of Military History collection vividly recall some of these conversations as they marched from Liberty Hall. The Rising was a statement of intent. The next 3 slides are just designed to give you some visual depiction of how artists saw the GPO, or the inside of the GPO. The first one, obviously, is an artist's depiction of the inside of the GPO. The second one here is a very poor quality photograph of volunteers taken actually inside the GPO, one that I'm sure many of you have seen over the last number of weeks. And finally, one that maybe a lot of people may not have seen is a sketch that was drawn by a gentleman called Charlie Soren while he was in detention in Frongok camp some months later. And in it, he visualises, he actually draws this sketch here, and it's Patrick Pearse addressing the 2nd Battalion. And if you can see my pointer, the red light here, this is Patrick Pearse. There's obviously 2 windows, both right and left to him as you're viewing the screen. And down here, seated facing the members of the 2nd Battalion for Fairview, you have 2 gentlemen here in the sketch. The man on the left is Connolly, and the man on the right is the O'Reilly. Interesting in the sense that it probably hasn't been seen by many people in the past. The rising was a statement of intent to prove that there was a body under arms determined to test the authorities, to see if now was the right time to take advantage of the weakness in their strength and disposition in Ireland. Intent to show that the physical force tradition was alive and well, and intent to maintain the tradition by continuity of action. How many days did the leadership anticipate they could hold out for? There is an argument for suggesting that even the publicity attracted from such an uprising in Ireland might put her position on a world stage, attracting attention from both America and other countries in Europe. There's some speculation that any time gained may result in support arriving from the continent, but more importantly, a belief that as the days passed, that the general population would come around to the notion that these were ordinary people making a stance again for Ireland and the right to govern herself. The volunteers produced newspapers during the week, and this was an opportunity to put their case to the people at home and abroad. Much more than that, it had placed their intent before us for all time. For what was committed to print would be committed to history. And of course we have the proclamation, which has been examined and held in close scrutiny in recent times. Each section can and will be interpreted by each in accordance with their beliefs. There is an argument that the key words contained within it may have been used to condemn the insurgents or rebels as they were considered. For in aligning themselves with foreign powers, the enemy of Britain, the volunteers condemned their position. In the days after the surrender, a certain momentum was gathered, from a position where the volunteers were both despised at one end of the scale for their action to being castigated by a proportion of the general population. Their treatment by the authorities and subsequent execution was to prove a turning point in their favour. One only has to examine what we might describe as the last letters of the leaders on the eve of execution to get a better feel for their mood. For in the main they are upbeat about what they have achieved for such little loss. They were reconciled with their fate and appeared to have been very philosophical in that regard. They meet with their next of kin whenever they were given the opportunity. In many of their last letters, they outlined that they are happy to die the soldier's death and believe that they have done right. I believe that they were reconciled with this outcome a long time out from the rising. Some convinced that it was this sacrifice that would make the mark and set the tone so that future generations would have a point of reference. Many of their last letters are quite formal, setting their personal affairs in order. There can be no more poignant document to hold in one's hands than an original letter written in those final hours by the leaders. There are some written accounts by next of kin and members of the religious recording the final visits, and while they are detailed in their description, they're still formal. Maybe the passage of time before these accounts were recorded served to maintain this formality. Maybe the next of kin could simply not express how harrowing those final moments must have been, even at a remove of 35 years. If any regrets are evident on the part of the leaders, it may be that they may not have been in a position to make suitable financial arrangements to look after their families. Nora Connolly, James Connolly's daughter, recounts her last visit to her father in an RT recording, and we get a more intimate feel for the meeting and also the father-daughter relationship. This is perhaps one of the more harrowing accounts. Patrick Pearse, in a letter on the 1st of May, stated, "I understand that the German expedition which I was counting on actually set sail but was defeated by the British." He wrote this as a postscript to his letter, and there has been much discussion of late by various scholars and commentators regarding this addition to the letter. As a barrister, Pearse would fully understand the implications of such a statement, perhaps hoping that this might condemn him alone and that his execution might satisfy the authorities and release others from the death penalty. On the 3rd of May, in another letter to his mother, he says, "We have done right. People will say hard things of us now, but later on they will praise us. Do not grieve for all this, but think of it as a sacrifice which God asked of me and you." MacDonagh was sentenced to be executed in the Stonebreaker's Yard at Kilmainham on the 3rd of May. Unable to see his wife, Muriel, he wrote to her hours before the execution, "I am ready to die, and I thank God that I am to die in so holy a cause. My country will reward my deed richly. I counted the cost of this, and I am ready to pay it." Similarly, Eamon Ceannt, in one of his last letters, wrote, "Ireland will honour those who risked all for her honour at Easter in 1916. Mrs. Kathleen Clark stated in her voice recording to the Bureau of Military History that both her husband and her brother, due for execution, Ned Daly, were, and I quote, "in a wonderful, exalted state of mind on eve of their execution." The leaders were executed. James Connolly was shot in a seated position on a chair, head slumped back with his hands untied, having been transported from Dublin Castle by ambulance. This sketch was drawn by Major Harold Heathcote of the 2nd 6th Sherwood Foresters, who was present at the execution. It could be said, considered or argued, that success came from failure, for it was the execution policy that condemned the leaders and the treatment and imprisonment of so many volunteers, including many who had not actually been or reported for duty on Easter week, that turned the tide of public favour in their direction. There was little separating so many in a society in many respects. We must remember that in little over 1 year, a split had turned colleagues into factions, one staying at home and others moving to support a war effort, for so many and varied a reason, and their dependents failing to empathise with the Irish volunteers. To understand and put some of the military successes attributable to the volunteers in context, we should look at the opposing forces. So the combined forces of the Irish Citizen Army, the Irish Volunteers and associated forces such as Cumann and the Hibernian Rifles were numerically small. If we were to take the total number of applicants awarded a 1916 medal from the state as reasonably accurate of the numbers reporting during the week, then there were 2,591 volunteers in action in one form or another. Of course, this figure does not include any persons who were active during the week and who made a very personal and individual decision not to apply for a medal or pension. But I anticipate that the numbers in this instance or case are pretty rare, quite unlike a number who did not apply for a medal or more particularly a pension from the state in recognition of their service in the War of Independence. Reports from newspapers in the aftermath of the Rising indicate that there were 4,000 British soldiers in the Dublin area on the 22nd of April, a few days before Easter Monday, of which 1,000 were reportedly available for fighting. Other official British Army strength returns from Monday the 26th of April indicate a total of 2,427 troops available in Dublin. There were 1,121 members on strength of a total establishment of 1,160 in the Dublin Metropolitan Police. And in addition to this, you had the Royal Irish Constabulary. The British forces in the Dublin area were soon to be reinforced by 2,500 troops from the Curragh and around the country. And by the end of the week, it is considered that there were at least 17,000 British troops in the Dublin area. So it could be argued that numerically the volunteers may have had sufficient strength to cause concern in the Dublin area initially. Strategically, the volunteer leadership made a number of decisions. They decided to attack and take what key buildings they believed might control or at least influence British ease of movement in and out of Dublin. And in addition, they seized or selected the GPO as their headquarters. They were not able to take Dublin Castle with its key communications network. They did not take key power supplies or indeed Trinity College. If one examines their eventual deployment, they were no doubt overstretched, and they had very limited ability to reinforce and resupply their own positions. The volunteers took positions almost in isolation with little thought given to mutual support. In fairness, they did deploy small numbers of volunteers around each of the principal headquarters, and these volunteers had quite a measure of success, incurring casualties on the opposing forces and disrupting their advance in military terms. It should be possible to defend a position with the equivalent of 1/3 of the attacking force, but taking and trying to hold buildings in an urban setting was far from conventionally studied tactics and still had not been experienced by troops involved in the European conflict. Success and failure should be examined in not only the immediate or short-term after-effects of the Rising, but also on its influences over the last 100 years to this calendar weekend. Militarily, the volunteers proved that with very limited resources that they could cause considerable casualties and serious disruption to the British forces. They were quite successful where deployed in small numbers outside their main battalion headquarters, in the area around the General Post Office, in North King Street, in the side streets around Jacobs, and deployed as snipers, they had considerable effect. Realisation that movement was achievable in small numbers and engaging on a different tactical level maintained a momentum in this type of operations. Where larger numbers were deployed in the main battalion headquarter positions, such as Jacobs, ultimately the College of Surgeons, Boland's Mills, and the general headquarters in the GPO, the volunteers found themselves either largely isolated and in some cases unengaged. In the South Dublin Union, which is St James Hospital Complex, the volunteers succeeded in delaying British ease of movement throughout the area for a considerable period with minimal force. The volunteer forces suffered under continuous fire and eventually were forced to vacate the position in the General Post Office on account of incendiary shelling resulting in fires that could not be contained. Subsequent to the Rising, the volunteers were to learn from this operation and realise that tying up large numbers in fixed defensive positions gained no great advantage. You may be able to hold a position for a period of time, but without reinforcement, resupply of food, water and ammunition, you are only moving one direction to surrender. The reality was that the lack of numbers resultant from the initial cancellation to mobilise and the final mobilisation on Easter Monday meant that numbers were well down on anticipated turnout. In the Mount Street area, the volunteers caused serious damage to the advancing British troops. As reinforcements were deployed throughout the week, large numbers arrived in Dunleary on Tuesday from England, including the Sherwood Foresters. On Wednesday, they were ordered to advance to contact with the volunteers on a number of routes into Dublin. However, as the troops advanced into Dublin on this particular axis towards Mount Street, they came under fire from a number of buildings. These buildings were forward positions of the 3rd Battalion, the Irish Volunteers, which had been deployed from Boland's Mills. Again, the same tactics of deploying a small number of men, independent of the outposts, achieved success and acted as reconnaissance. 4 main outposts and ultimately 3 positions at 25 Northumberland Road, Clanwilliam House and the Parochial Hall were occupied by volunteers. From their position in one house, the volunteers, 2 volunteers in particular, Lieutenant Michael Malone and volunteer James Grace, supported by a few younger volunteers who were released from combat prior to the main engagement, succeeded in inflicting considerable casualties on the advancing British troops. Volunteer Grace succeeded in escaping, but Lieutenant Michael Malone was killed within the building. In other buildings considered to be part of the overall defensive position, the volunteers achieved considerable success, but also suffered heavy casualties. They were armed with a mix of small weapons, including rifles, shotguns, revolvers and pistols, with a supply of ammunition equating to between 150 and 250 rounds or bullets of ammunition for each weapon. The volunteers held off the advancing British troops for a number of hours. A lot of research has been initiated into this particular action by a team of historians and specialists in recent years to evaluate the actual success of both the volunteers, examining their weaponry, training and profile, and an outline of the results are available on the web. Given the relative lack of experience of these volunteers defending their positions and laying down fire on the advancing British troops, they were very successful in this engagement. It is important also to record that these British troops were also recent intakes, and consequently this was their first exposure to live fire. Casualties recorded on both sides are still the source of discussion, ranging from 234 killed and wounded on the British side at the outer end to 4 volunteers killed out of a total force of 17 volunteers. Statistically, the volunteers suffered greater losses, but theirs was the more impressive action. And accounts of this, for those of you that are interested, are available within the Bureau of Military History and also in the oral archives maintained by RTE. In one of these, Tom Walsh, one of the surviving volunteers of this action, records the engagement. There are even interviews available to RTE extant or surviving with survivors of the British troops that came over and were engaged in the action. In isolating the volunteers' positions, the British troops could have surrounded the area and awaited the inevitable outcome of surrender. However, by way of explanation, when an order is given to take a position or advance on certain lines in military command, then that order must be complied with. Consideration may have been given that leaving a rebel position or rebel outpost active would be seen as a sign of weakness or inability on the part of the British Army to close out the action. Also, leaving a rebel position active does not secure an area and leaves alternative advancing troops potentially exposed on their flanks. In this case, Colonel McConchy, who was the British brigade commander, actually sought permission to isolate these positions and move forward, but was not given that permission. The success achieved in the engagement with the authorities at Ashbourne was in a different genre. A small number of volunteers isolated and engaged an RIC barracks in Ashbourne village and succeeded in forcing the policemen to surrender same. Having done so, they moved back to their original positions and finally elsewhere to reinforce, rearm and freshen up. They incurred fewer casualties than the RAC and had adopted the role of attacker rather than defender. In the rural setting, they moved by bicycle. A more detailed examination of this action will identify some key differences than elsewhere. The volunteers were engaging with the police rather than the military. Although the police were able to move speedily by motorised transport to try and reinforce their colleagues, the volunteers had isolated and forced the surrender of a number of police barracks prior to the final action at Ashbourne. The volunteers were able to use the landscape to their advantage, and there is some evidence to presume that some of the police may have used this occasion to kill one of their own officers in one of the engagements with the volunteers. Although large numbers of police were deployed, they failed to succeed in reinforcing their colleagues. The volunteers were elated at this success, and this encouraged them thinking that more action was feasible. They were ordered to lay down their arms by Pearse after the surrender in Dublin. The rising blood of a new generation. Few had military experience in other armies such as Connolly, Mallon, O'Connell and McBride. Some had direct links, being sons of British servicemen of an earlier period. But in the main, the Rising was the first time the volunteers were tested under fire. Training prior to Easter 16 had been limited to the use of smaller bore rifles, largely in short ranges, supplemented with standard military drill and general exercises and manoeuvres. Their training appears to be more than sufficient to allow them to perform well both under fire and in engagement, as some of my previous examples outline. Interviews with veterans who had served in the General Post Office, such as Joseph Sweeney, who later on was to become a Chief of Staff of the Defence Forces, also highlights the range of military understanding and training of those under arms. Terminology such as enfilade and defilade fire being used by way of explanation in an interview makes one rethink the military understanding and training of those present at the time. The experiences gave rise to a greater understanding and discussion as to the requirements of what it would take to win the next time. The roundup of over 3,500 suspects and imprisonment of over 2,000 facilitated an opportunity to analyse tactics, consolidate and restructure while in detention. The volunteer leadership utilised their time well together. For the British, in effect, through imprisoning such large numbers, provided a greater opportunity for the volunteers to examine their success and failings and determine the course going forward. How many times have we heard of the prison camp in Frongoch in Wales as being referred to as the University of Revolution? For from the moment the volunteers were released, they were organised in such a fashion that they had personnel in the railway stations and ports, particularly Dunleary, intercepting their colleagues returning home on release. I remember speaking with the son of a prominent volunteer who recalled this methodology. For the movement forward started in 16, and it's in aftermath the tactics were to change in realisation of the strengths and weaknesses of both the British and the volunteers. The execution policy converted public opinion in favour of the volunteers. For initially, public reaction came out very much against the volunteers, even in the mid-1970s, in what I believe to be a very frank response to a question put by Cathal O'Shannon in a documentary programme titled Emmett Dalton remembers. Dalton, who had served as a British officer on the front in Europe with his troops during the First World War, when asked what did he think about the volunteers' uprising in Dublin, stated that, and I quote, he did not think very much of it. He indicated that he did not think favourably about what had been initiated in Dublin and elsewhere. This was a very honest answer, given the benefit of time and the subsequent position of Dalton as a senior officer in the National Army. He was present while accompanying Michael Collins when he was killed at Bain-la-Blas on the 22nd of August 1922. Remember that there were many families living with the day-to-day concerns for their loved ones, fighting for the rights of small nations, and the other many and varied reasons that individuals went to the trenches. These families came out very strong against the volunteers and were vocal and prominent in their display. The exceptional number of civilian casualties, including children, of which we heard so much about during the week, was no doubt a major factor influencing public opinion. The unsuccessful campaign at Gallipoli had commenced just 1 year in advance of the rising. Was it examined, or how did it affect the thinking of the leadership of the volunteers? After the rising, there was a realisation that the same tactics would not be employed again. With limited manpower and resources and the need to maximise the use and effect of same, active service units and flying columns were deployed. Maximum effect could be inflicted on the authorities by minimal resources. The key was not only to inflict serious casualties and maximise damage, but also to have a serious effect on the morale of the occupying forces. A battle against, in effect, an underground army was to prove an extremely different challenge for the British Army. And of course, these tactics were to be examined around the world by other armies. Thereafter, it was obvious that the volunteers must infiltrate all sections of the local community and develop a greater ability to gather information or intelligence on the enemy and its administration. The strength of any force is determined or advanced by a number of factors, and one of these is its ability to collate timely information about its opposition. The British administration had illustrated how valuable information could influence the outcome of events in 16, notwithstanding superior forces. Now it was time for the volunteers to learn similar lessons. Critically, the improvement in the gathering of intelligence subsequent to the rising was to result from a number of factors. More of the population had turned in favour of supporting the volunteers and the IRA in the period leading into and during the War of Independence. And secondly, the IRA had much closer control over the movement of information through the postal system, the courts, the shops, and through local information gathering or collection. Mails were monitored and informants identified by local trial. In some cases, the IRA were not particularly selective, systematic, or right in executing what were, in effect, deserters from the British Army who either posed no threat, rather the reverse. And in some cases, all one had to be was homeless to attract such attention and to be singled out by the IRA. The lead into the rising, the 6 days in action, and the subsequent imprisonment of so many facilitated an opportunity for persons of different socio-economic, trade and professions, and religious and cultural backgrounds to interact. So many men and women from different, diverse backgrounds were engaged. The influence of the rising can also be examined in its effects on general public opinion and analysis on the days and months followed. Students in one school in Dublin, who actually had a British officer training corps based within the school, designed to provide basic military instruction for young men, actually challenged the discussion around the rising in their school debates. And some personal writings amongst the students afterwards indicate a sympathy towards the rebels and their cause. This was also going to influence students in the subsequent War of Independence from that particular school. Short, medium and long-term success, or indeed failure, of the rising must be examined. The rising sparked the movement that was unstoppable. The desire for self-control and to see the removal of the British administration took on an altogether different momentum. And this was evident across a range of areas in the aftermath of the insurrection of 16, literally, artistically, culturally, politically and militarily. Militarily, the failure to mobilise large numbers nationwide in a coordinated fashion on Easter Monday, resultant from confusion arising from the countermanding order, meant that those reporting for duty were not going to have the same effect as a maximum turnout. The reduction in numbers in Dublin, and more importantly the confusion around the country, had serious effects on the outcome outside the capital. Isolated activity in Enniscorthy, Galway, Louth and Cork proved too uncoordinated and in some cases too late in the week to have effect. The secrecy attached to the planning by the Military Council resulted in a lack of communications within the volunteer ranks. There is no doubt that secrecy was vital, but this caused its own problems in the lead into the mobilisation. Keeping the facts from McNeill and in turn trying to reactivate the volunteers after the cancellation of manoeuvres for Easter Sunday. False propaganda also appears to have spread during the week. Strategically and tactically, the volunteers made some mistakes. Considerable reconnaissance of the plan of battle had been carried out in the years preceding the rising, and this plan was based on certain expectations, such as numbers reporting for active service. The deployment on Easter Monday was stretched as a result, and this meant that the greater plan for controlling access routes into the city was compromised. The decision to occupy the General Post Office had more symbolic but little tactical reasoning. Some commentators argue that it was a focal point within the centre of the city and attracted attention. The decision to locate so many of the volunteer leadership within the GPO is also questionable. Trinity College may have been strategically a better location to occupy, though too large to control in its entirety. Either way, the volunteers tried to activate a plan designed around greater numbers. Anticipating a level of confusion on mobilisation after the countermanding order, the leadership should have consolidated their actual forces in the capital reporting on Easter Monday and reduced the number of key points or buildings to be taken and held. Numbers were simply not available to control the capital, and the perimeter should have been reduced or arguably pulled back to one side of the River Liffey, using the bridges for defensive purposes. Tightening this perimeter would have enabled the volunteers to provide greater mutual support and hold out for longer. One of the initial actions of the rising, well known to all of us, involved the attack on Dublin Castle, where members of the Irish Citizen Army under Captain Sean Connolly fired one of the earlier shots of the rising and killed a policeman, Constable James O'Brien from Limerick. Hesitancy on the part of the shocked volunteers and prompt decision by a British officer ensured the gates were closed, and the ability of the volunteers to breach the castle was halted. Unsure of the strength of the British garrison in the castle, the volunteers found themselves taking the City Hall alongside. With such few personnel guarding such an important building, an opportunity to take the historic headquarters of the British administration in Ireland was lost, and with it the loss of a tactically superior location. The volunteers made some other mistakes, such as digging in trenches in Stephen's Green. They quickly realised that they were exposed to fire from British troops from surrounding positions in buildings such as the Shelbourne Hotel, and as a result of this, they moved directly into this very building. Having examined this particular case, it may be worth further study, as the position of all the trenches is not yet clear. Many good dug-in positions were situated at the outer corners of Stephen's Green, close to the railings. These would afford very good positions on any enemy forces advancing on the green from all directions. But unfortunately, overview from the surrounding buildings was the complication. The very high casualty count on the civilian population that I mentioned must be considered as one of the main failures, extremely high by comparison to the military and police casualties on both sides. Within these casualties, the loss of children was an even greater tragedy. Civilian casualties occurred from, in some cases, indiscriminate fire engaging the enemy, both sides being responsible. Others resulted from the sheer brutality of war and lack of operational control over troops. There is still quite an amount of research ongoing by relatives who lost loved ones that have reason to believe that they were actually associated with the volunteers and other groupings out during the week rather than actually being civilians. Failure to exploit or drive home a military advantage in some of the engagements came as a result on the part of the volunteers as lack of experience, lack of complete intelligence or information, lack of resources, lack of confidence, and of course lack of communications. For the inability to make contact with each of the battalion areas as the week progressed was one of the single greatest problems encountered by the volunteers. The casualties inflicted on the volunteers was not particularly great, with 62 being killed in action amongst the ranks of the Irish Citizen Army and the FINA and the volunteers themselves. But the execution of so many of the leaders was a huge loss. Large parts of the city were destroyed as a result of fire in particular, damage that was to take some time for the city to recover from, compounded as it was by the ongoing more limited damage during the War of Independence and, of course, the subsequent Civil War. Success on the part of the authorities of the day can be analysed in a number of ways. They defeated the rebels, as they were classified, in 6 days. Although they had not taken sufficient cognizance of the warning signs by maintaining proper strength within barracks over the Easter weekend, for the reverse should have been the case, the authorities reacted speedily and had additional troops in the Dublin area by Monday evening in support from the Curragh and latterly from elsewhere in the country. They also reinforced quickly from England, with troops arriving in by Tuesday evening. Their call-out procedures, as they would be described, worked well by any standards. They quickly determined where the volunteers had established their strong points and effectively broke the city down into sections and cut the rebel positions off from each other, each area in effect becoming a separate battleground. The arrest and imprisonment of so many in the aftermath of the rising was achievable using the high level of intelligence gathered not only the weeks and months preceding the rising, but also the years leading into the rebellion. For British military and naval intelligence in particular, provided the requisite information to monitor and trail the odd. RIC and local intelligence enabled the authorities to track and arrest Roger Casement. An examination of all available source material will support any argument in favour that the British authorities were maintaining a day-to-day check on persons of interest around the city and country. Perhaps the only weakness identified by my research is that the authorities became almost complacent in their responsibility. However, there may have also been a lack of coordination amongst the various intelligence gathering agencies. For there's no doubt that the war effort distracted the authorities, and that familiarity to large numbers in military dress around the city, particularly around the city, was another factor at play. For aside from complacency, there's no doubt that the British authorities failed to grasp the immediacy of the situation, even though they had intelligence reports indicating that trouble was expected on that very weekend in Dublin. There was a failure on the part of the authorities to fully and accurately assess the military strength, training and ability of the volunteers in advance of the rising. When the fighting broke out, they lacked some of the flexibility to adapt to the situation, particularly in the capital. And given, of course, that Britain had been in a war footing since 1914, this should not have been the case. They should have been more than flexible to adapt to the situation. This image, taken from a magazine, quite obviously, apologies for the slide, shows British troops forming up outside the Shelbourne Hotel. And I say, and I put this as a question to you, presumably they were no longer concerned about rebel activity in the area around the Green when this photograph was taken. Otherwise, I don't think you'd find troops, or you certainly shouldn't find troops, standing out in such a fashion outside a building. Of course, continued exposure to war in Europe and elsewhere perhaps gave Britain a false sense of security in relation to Ireland, posting personnel who had been severely traumatised at the front to garrison the home counties or home countries was exposed in some cases with the outbreak of violence in Dublin in 1916. In one particular case, Captain Boland Colthurst, who was based in Portobello Barracks, was responsible for the arrest and wrongful execution without authority of Sheehy, Skeffington, Dixon and McIntyre in the guardroom of that same barracks. The war had far-reaching consequences, and the British military authorities failed to maintain control over this man in particular. Found guilty by reason of insanity, Boland Colthurst spent some time in incarceration and was subsequently to emigrate to Canada to lead a new life. The effect of the writings of Dan Breen, although he was not a participant in the rising, the writings of Arthur Griffith, and others, influenced revolution in other parts of the world. Just as the tactics developed by Collins during the Anglo-Irish War were to be mimicked elsewhere, India was to stage its own rebellion in 1930 in Chittagong, where the leaders commenced with a death cult embraced as a result of their readings and examinations of the 1916 rising. Dr. Kate O'Malley has carried out excellent research on the Indian case study, and other historians are also researching Russia and China for comparison. The rising provided not only another turning point in the age-old conflict, but it should be considered the start of the final military campaign against the British administration that was to lead to a truce in July 2021, a treaty in December 21, and the recognition of a free state thereafter, with the final proclamation of a republic in 1949. The vision carried by those into the battle in 16 resulted not only in a physical manifestation, but literally, artistically, and culturally, all things changed after the Rising. Cultural nationalism now had a new subject matter, reaffirmed in blood and martyrdom. The creativity of many of the prisoners in detention after the Rising and in the subsequent years, through their handcraft, drawing and writing, was to be used by the successor of the Irish Volunteers, the Irish Republican Army, not only for propaganda, but also as an expression of a revitalised cultural movement. The image of the soldier, not only in the modern form, but also stepping back into Irish mythology to Cuchulainn, was to feature in the iconography of the post-rebellion period. The image of the dying warrior, tied to the principle of defence and dying for Ireland, was restated. Oliver Shepherd's image of Cuchulainn stands out, but many poets, artists and sculptors restated, almost reworked, and maintained this vision in their works. Within the Garden of Remembrance, Oisin Kelly's sculpture, The Children of Lear, stands in front of a poem titled We Saw a Vision by Liam McUshin. Poetry changed. Yeats provided Easter 1916 and Ledwidge on MacDonagh as examples. The writings, ideologies and last letters of the leaders, containing as they did all the elements of self-sacrifice, were given to the people, and the creativity through many art forms giving us music, such as Sean O'Reilly's Mish Éire. This year, a new generation, aware of the huge commitment made by their forefathers, formed the crowd that gathered on the thoroughfares and streets to enjoy a parade which was designed to remember, respect and commemorate those who came out in 1916, to maintain a continuity of physical force action, which was ultimately, within a few short years, to lead to an Irish Free State and the right to govern ourselves. The proclamation that we reflect on to this very day embodied the desire and aspirations of the dead generations that preceded the Rising, and also those that stepped out in 1916. For the Rising was a statement of intent. The proclamation reaffirmed and laid out the desires and hopes of those who committed themselves under arms in 1916. The Rising was a statement of intent, and its success can be measured by each and every one of us to this day by our own standards and personal aspirations. Thank you.